afternoon. My name is David Goodwin, and I am the Assistant Director at the Fordham University Center on Religion and Culture. Many thanks for joining us today for our third Duffy Fellows Program event, The Luminous Religion. How was Christianity translated into Chinese? This past academic year, the Center on Religion and Culture welcomed 5 current Fordham students or recent graduates as our inaugural Duffy Fellows. These fellows undertook independent research and creative projects exploring the intersection between religion and public life. You can find the full calendar of Duffy Fellow events on our website. We'll share that link in a minute. The Duffy Fellows program was made possible thanks to a gift by the late James Duffy, a longtime friend of the CRC and Fordham University. This program demonstrates how your support might directly contribute to the CRC and its mission. If you enjoyed today's event, please consider making a gift, no matter how small. We'll be sharing a link for donations in the chat box in a moment. Today, China is known for 3 major faith traditions: Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. But did you know a Christian presence has existed in China since 635 AD? Persian monks from what is contemporary Iraq, Syria, and Iran traveled along the Silk Road, bringing Christianity into East Asia. Thanks to archaeological evidence, scholars know that this community of Christian believers was a prospering one. These findings also document the methods that Syriac-speaking Persian monks used to translate Christian concepts and ideas into the Chinese language and culture. Today, I'm excited to introduce Duffy Fellow Anastasia McGrath. Anastasia is a 2021 graduate of Fordham University, and she was Fordham's first Chinese studies major. She recently wrote a video script for Religion for Breakfast, a popular religious studies YouTube channel. Her script was based on her own original research for today's presentation. This coming July, Anastasia will be traveling to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota to serve as a volunteer middle school teacher at the Red Cloud Indian School. In the future, she hopes to attend graduate school to study linguistic anthropology. A little housekeeping before we begin. In a moment, I'll turn the conversation over to Anastasia. Then, after 30 minutes or so, we'll open up the discussion to questions from you, our audience. Feel free to enter your comments and questions in the chat box. Please remember to be respectful to our speaker and your fellow audience members. We are recording today and we'll be posting the video on our YouTube channel in a few days. With that, please join me in welcoming Duffy Fellow Anastasia McGrath.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Director Goodwin, so much for that great introduction. Thanks to all my friends and family and other participants for coming and hearing me speak today. And I also definitely just want to take a moment to thank the Fordham Center on Religion and Culture for sponsoring this project. Definitely without their support, I wouldn't be here speaking to you today and sharing all this interesting research I've done. So thank you so much, CRC. So just give me a moment to share my screen and then we can go ahead and get started. Okay. So today I will be presenting on the Luminous religion, which is actually the first name that Christianity entered China under. So this is a history and a region that many of us are unfamiliar with. So I want to begin by starting with a little historical background on this time period and China during the medieval era. So thanks to the Silk Road and tolerant policies towards foreigners on the part of the emperor, China was a very multi-ethnic and multi-religious state during this era. And this presentation is about how, interestingly, one of the many religions active in China during this time was Christianity. So who were these Christians? Well, as Director Goodwin said earlier in the introduction, they were probably ethnic Persians from modern day Iran and other adjacent countries. And they traveled along the Silk Road into China and were received by one of China's most famous emperors, Tang Taicong, in 635 AD in China's ancient capital, Chang'an. So if we're looking at the map here, these Christians traveled from the far right area that's unfortunately off the borders here and made their way all along the Silk Road into China along the Imperial Highway to the central Chinese city of Chang'an, which today is called Xi'an, and it's in central China. So it's like below the Great Wall at the end of the Huanghe River. So they didn't make it as far as Beijing or Shanghai or the cities that we know today as the centers of Chinese language and culture. But they did make it to China's ancient capital and the center of the empire at the time. So one thing that's important to note is that these are not Roman or Catholic Christians. The first Christians who came into China were actually from the Church of the East. So just to say a little bit about the Church of the East, it was completely independent of the Roman Church for various reasons. So while the Roman Church was headed by a pope in Rome, the Church of the East was headed by a patriarch seated in Seleucia Ctesiphon, or modern day Baghdad. But like the Roman Church, which was active in Europe during this era, the Church of the East also had an extensive missionary effort across Asia using the Silk Road. So the Church of the East was able to go to places as far away as China and India thanks to utilizing the Silk Road. So now I just want to say a little bit about what these Christians' lives were like in China. Okay. So these Christians were actually very popular in China. In the capital, the emperor promoted the building of Christian churches and monasteries financially. He also sponsored for a lot of Christian documents to be translated into the imperial library. These Persian Christians acted as advisors in the court, and actually a Christian cohort were always guests at the emperor's birthday party. So that's something a little bit fun to think about. But yeah, they had a very high societal standing in Tang China. And there's scores of archaeological evidence to corroborate not only their existence in China, but also their culture. So documents have been found at various sites throughout China, but some of the most famous ones were found at a site called Dunhuang in Gansu province. And here I have a couple pictures of some of the documents that were found. So this is some artwork that was found at Dunhuang. The picture on the left is the original, and the picture on the right is an artist's reproduction of what this picture probably looked like when it was first made. And so this is an image of Jesus done by the Christian community living in China during the Tang Dynasty. And we know that it's Jesus because you can see the cross at the top of the figure's head in a kind of circlet. You can probably see it more clearly in the picture on the right in the reproduction. But what's important to me about this image, and what's important about this image to talking about Christianity in China during this time, is that it clearly displays the syncretic influence that was going on between Christianity and the other religions active in China at the time. So this is an image of Jesus, but it's not like any image of Jesus we'd be familiar with here in the West, because this is done in the Buddhist style. And this is most clearly influenced by the hand gesture that the figure is making with their right hand. That's a typical Buddhist gesture. So some of the syncretic influence stayed at the aesthetic level, like in this picture, but some of it went into the translations that I talk about in this presentation. And the single most important indication of this, and the single most important find that the Christian community in China from this era left behind, and what this presentation is about, is the Xi'an Stele. So what is the Xi'an Stele? We know all this about Christianity in China because the stele is a stone monument that was discovered in the early 1600s that kind of records the story of how this early Christian community made their way into China. So it records how a contingent of the Church of the East, led by a bishop called Ben in the text, arrived in China in 635 AD and was received by the emperor. And interestingly, a lot of scholars think that Ben is like a phonetic Chinese approximation for the name Abraham. So that's something to think about. And the stele records in its inscription that it was erected in 845 AD. So we have almost 200 years from 635 to 845 of a sustained Christian presence in Tang, China. But unfortunately, it was likely buried less than 100 years after it was put up. And scholars don't know for sure exactly why the Xi'an stele was buried, but a lot of them conclude that it was probably done to protect it from a widespread anti-Buddhism campaign that Christianity and other foreign religions got swept up into. Because even at this time, during the medieval ages, Buddhism was still considered a Western religion from northern India and China. So it was still not fully indigenized within society. And 2/3 of the stele's inscription records how Christianity, or the Luminous religion, as it's called in its inscription, spread in China. So it tells the story of Alabun and the Emperor Tang Taizong and their meeting. But 1/3 of it, the 1/3 that I looked at, is about specifically theological content. So this presentation is going to examine the Christian terms and concepts with theological significance used in the stele's inscription. But I know some of you probably are unfamiliar with Chinese or the Chinese language. So I do just want to give a short, quick explanation of the mechanics of how Chinese works. So the image here on the left is a rubbing of the Xi'an stele, and the big characters at the top, the 9 of them, are the stele's title. So I'm going to read it up and down from right to left. And so the title of the stele in Chinese reads 大秦景教六行中国碑. And there's a lot of different ways to translate this, but scholars usually do it somewhere along the lines of monument to the propagation of the Luminous religion in China. So even though Chinese is oriented differently in text, it actually, the sentences themselves kind of take the same order as English with subject, verb, object. And what's important to my project and what I really looked at were the words themselves. So an individual Chinese word is called a character, and characters can be combined to create words, but they're also words in and of themselves. So for example, we can take the word China, and that's in the upper left corner of the title. So the rectangular character with the line in the middle of it in the top left is zhong, and the one below it is guo. And together that means China. And but zhong and guo are also words in and of themselves. So zhong means middle, and guo means like country or kingdom. So together they mean the middle kingdom, but in Chinese, that's the word for China. So that's just a little bit about how Chinese works at a very surface level understanding. And I hope that helps you kind of understand a little bit more about what I did in this project examining how Christian terms and concepts were translated into Chinese. So the first word that I want to talk about, and probably the word that's most central to Christianity, is the word for God that's used in the Xi'an stele's inscription. So the word for God is 法我呵 in the Xi'an stele's inscription, and it's the word that we have here at the top of this diagram. So one thing that's important to note is that the pronunciations for Chinese characters have changed over time. So nowadays, we would pronounce it as 法我呵, but in the past, especially in the medieval era, it would have been pronounced as 阿拉哈. So in scholarship today, there's kind of 2 major theories for how the author of the Xi'an stele inscription came to use the word Aloha or Alaha to refer to God in the inscription. And the first is that it's a phonetic transliteration of Syriac. So why Syriac? Well, Syriac was the Church of the East liturgical language, and it's actually derived from Aramaic. So one interesting thing to know is that the Christians in China during this time were kind of speaking a language closer to Jesus's than their European, Latin, and Greek-speaking counterparts. So that's something interesting to think about. And theory one is really convincing because the Syriac word for God is Alaha, and the word for God in the Xi'an Stele inscription is also Alaha. So they do sound strikingly similar, almost exactly alike. But I think theory two adds some nuance to this idea that Alaha or Aloha is just a phonetic transliteration. So theory two says that Aloha is derived from a different Chinese religious term, Alohan, which itself is derived from a Buddhist word from the Sanskrit arat. And the best evidence for theory two is that Aloha itself is also used to refer to arats in some texts like the Lotus Sutra, which is one of the most famous Buddhist religious texts in China. So what is an arat? An arat is a Buddhist term for someone who has reached enlightenment. So it's kind of analogous to Christian saints in that they both achieved the goals of their religion. And it's probably extremely likely that the use of the word Alaha or Aloha is derived from theory two, coming from this original Sanskrit word and being from Buddhist texts and Buddhist words and terms and concepts already existing in Chinese rather than this phonetic transliteration from Syriac. And that's because the author of the Xi'an Stele inscription, who's listed as a monk named Jingjing, is recorded in some Chinese encyclopedia texts to have worked with a Buddhist priest from North India in translating Buddhist works. So this is evidence for a professional working relationship between Buddhists and Christians during this time, working on translating their own respective religious texts. And it also, this historical evidence indicates that Christian monks, like the author of the inscription, would have been really familiar with Buddhist vocabulary, especially Chinese Buddhist vocabulary, even if they weren't comprehending fully enough to understand their meaning. So this could explain how Alaha or Aloha was chosen to refer to God, even though it doesn't really have a parallel meaning to the original word in Sanskrit as arat, which is more analogous to, a saint. So, it's clear here that Syriac phonetic transliteration definitely doesn't tell the full story of how the word Alaha or Aloha ended up in the Xi'an Stele inscription. But sometimes I think the avoidance of phonetic transliteration is more obvious. So we can take, for example, how the Stele uses a translated term of the Trinity, for example. And the Trinity, of course, is always one of the most historically difficult Christian concepts to translate into any language because it is kind of hard to understand. So in the Stele's inscription, there's actually two distinct phrases used to refer to the Trinity. And I have them here. So the first one is 在你喵生, and the second is 在你分身. So to break it down, these phrases only differ in one character. So the first two characters are the same, which is san and yi. And those are both numbers meaning 3 and 1. So we have half the basis of what the Trinity is. And both these 4 character phrases finish with the word for body, or shen, which is the last character that you see in both of these phrases. Where they differ is kind of like the quantifier before the word for body. So the first one uses miao, which is an adjective meaning mysterious or unique. And the second one uses fun. So fun can be a verb meaning to divide, or it can be a quantifier used to refer to smaller parts of a greater whole. So this leaves us with a question, which is why these two differing phrases? Well, this is probably due to the different contexts of the sentences in which they are used. So the first sentence in the Stele inscription that references the Trinity is talking about God's nature, or the nature of God. So it makes sense that the word for the Trinity used in this particular sentence would incorporate the use of an adjective to give a description of God's mysterious nature. And the second sentence is more of an explanation of the specific role that the Messiah plays in the Trinitarian relationship. So there's a shift in the theme of the sentences from God's nature to the mechanics of the Trinity relationship itself. So it makes sense that the phrases would be different to reflect those different contexts. But there's still a few questions left, which is why did the translator and the author of the inscription create these unique and somewhat complex phrases as opposed to just transliterating the original Syriac to have just like a standardized word or term used to refer to the Trinity? And I think that's because of the Church of the East's historical association with Nestorian Christianity. So just to say a little bit about who Nestorius was and what his connection is with the Church of the East in the Persian Empire at this time. Nestorius, who you can see in the picture on the right, was one of the foremost Christological heretics of the early church. Christological referring to the nature of Christ. So Nestorius was excommunicated for rejecting the title of Theotokos, or God-bearer for Mary. So Nestorius thought that this overemphasized Jesus's divinity, but his detractors thought that he was overemphasizing Jesus's humanity. So he was excommunicated and defrocked, and he wasn't a bishop in the church anymore, and he died in exile. But his followers lived on in the Persian Empire by linking up with the already existing Church of the East there. So what does all of this church politics and church history have to do with the translated terms and words for the Trinity and the Stele's inscription? Well, maybe these two phrases are longer and more complicated than a phonetically transliterated term, but they do clearly enumerate the meaning of the Trinity more clearly. So perhaps the Christians in China didn't want to make a transliterated term from their liturgical language of Syriac because they wanted to avoid any situations of heresy. And this is thinking back on their followers' previous issues with talking about God's nature, like Nestorius. So here again, we see the importance of keeping in mind that phonetic transliteration definitely doesn't tell the full story of how these terms and concepts were created. So lastly, I just want to finish up with the word for Christianity itself used in the Stele's inscription and the title of this presentation. So the word for Christianity is Jingjiao. And to break it down, Jing means luminous, and it's the first character in the Chinese word that you see here. And Jiao means teaching. So usually this translates to luminous religion. And why Jingjiao is a concept that has puzzled scholars of Christianity in China for decades. What does the word luminous have anything to do with Christianity? And there are three theories in scholarship today that I think try to answer that question. And the first theory involves breaking down the character Jing into its components. So if you look at the third line of the bullet point here, Jing can be broken down into two separate parts. The first part, meaning sun or day, and the second part, Jing, meaning great or powerful. So if you break down Jing into its two components, you get Jing Jiao, which translates to kind of like powerful sun religion. So some scholars think that breaking down Ding into its components proves that it's a reference to a different religion or Buddhist sect active in China at the time, which is the Varyo-Chana sect. And the word for the Varyo-Chana sect in Chinese, or at least medieval Chinese, was Da Jiao. And that also kind of translates to great sun religion. So some scholars think that this is a reference, and perhaps that the monks in China at the time who were trying to talk about Christianity in Chinese society and culture wanted to kind of show this association with Buddhism, which was really popular in China at the time. And one of the ways to do this was kind of linguistically reference popular Buddhist sects. But the second theory is that Jing harkens back to biblical imagery or images of light and dark. That's really important to Christian mysticism and iconography. So Jing, meaning luminous, kind of harkens back to the idea of Jesus as the light of the world. And the final theory is that Jing Zhao helped these Christian monks preserve the K sound in Christianity. So the pronunciation of Chinese characters have changed over time. So back in the medieval era, this would have been pronounced as King Kao. So that would have helped these monks preserve like the iconic status of the Ke in Christianity or Christ. And as for me, I think that a combination of theories 2 and 3 is the most likely. I think that the Persian Christians who wrote the Xi'an Stele inscription really knew Chinese very well, but I don't think they had the insider's knowledge to engage in the complex character word building that theory 1 suggests. So I think putting together theories 2 and 3 can help answer the puzzling question of why Jing Jiao. So I just want to finish up with a short conclusion. Basically, what I want you all to take away from this presentation is that the prevailing narrative, I think, in scholarship is that the single most important goal that these Christian monks in China had when they were translating their documents and translating Christianity was that they wanted to replicate the Syriac as much as possible in their texts and in the Stele's inscription. But I think this research shows that the choices for these translations were not only based on phonetic similarity to the monks' native Syriac, but also that these translators considered many other factors, such as the Chinese characters or the words themselves, theological and etymological significance. So that's basically my main conclusion. I know I'm running out of time here, but I would definitely like you all to take away that the religious landscape of China in the time, the Church of the East's own history, and definitely Buddhism were also 3 major factors that definitely played a role in these translations. And replicating Syriac was definitely not the most important role or factor that the translators were juggling with. Okay, so with that being said, I'm gonna stop share and pass it back over to Director Goodwin for the Q&A.
Thank you, Anastasia. That was an amazing presentation. I'm really impressed how you're able to thread together these very different disciplines, art, archaeology, language, religion, and create this compelling narrative and really introduce us to, at least introduce me to a history and a time that was completely unknown. So the first question, and now some questions are trickling in, so I'll give people a moment. So I'll ask the first one. What's made you want to research this topic? What initially drew you to it?
I actually took a class my junior year called Christianity in China, and I was just really surprised to learn that there had been Christians in China as early as the medieval era in 635 AD. So just to like give everyone some context, like this would have been happening around the same time that Charlemagne was converting European tribes. And that was kind of eye-opening to me to see how much or how far Christianity had spread in both directions from the Middle East. So I definitely wanted to learn more about that. And that was kind of a lot of what I talked about during the historical background part of this presentation. But one of the things that fascinates me about Chinese is that, so like I learned modern Chinese, and I think Chinese is one of the few languages where a student like me, who's not a native speaker and learning modern Chinese, can still analyze texts and documents from thousands of years ago, because Chinese is a 5,000-year-old continuous culture. And I can still read stuff in Chinese that was written like the Xi'an Stele um, in the 7th century. So to me, I definitely wanted to use that skill that I have in Chinese to kind of find out more about the past, and engage myself more deeply with the language that is like so ancient, and learn a little bit more about how it's changed over time.
Oh, so here's an interesting question that has come through. So this involves the language and the translation process. So the original Syriac monks, or Syriac speaking monks that traveled from Persia to China, were they how were they able to translate the original Western or Greek concepts about Jesus, God, the Trinity, Christianity into Chinese? Were they able to do that? Were they successful? Did they change in any way?
Yeah, so interestingly, they left behind a lot of documents and a lot of archaeological evidence, like the steles inscription that I talk about, that I think scholars can look at to see a little bit more about how their translation methods changed over time during the 200 years that that particular group of Christians were active in China. So, actually, when they first came into China, like, they needed to use the imperial scribes a lot because they didn't really know Chinese. So the imperial scribes, who were, native Chinese speakers and people, had to really hold their hands through translating Chinese or Christian religious texts into Chinese. But then you see, by the time of the Xi'an Stele, which is like erected in 845 AD, so almost 200 years after they first arrived, now they have a lot more ability and skill in the Chinese language to be able to pick and choose which words from Buddhism that they thought were analogous to Christian terms and concepts, and kind of create phrases like what I talked about with how they refer to the Trinity and use certain adjectives or change the characters based on the content of the sentences. So, as for how they translated in Latin and Greek, I think a lot of that is they were two separate churches, so they did have two separate like liturgical languages. But as for how that translated into what they were doing in China, I think that the monks definitely were able to become more adept over time in translating more effectively.
So it's interesting you mentioned that I'm probably going to garble the pronunciation for the Xi'an Stele. Someone asked that their understanding is that the resurrection of Christ was not included in that due to political reasons. Do you know if that's true or not?
So yeah, like I said, only 1/3 of the Xi'an Stele inscription is actually about theology. Like 2/3 of it is kind of like a monument to the emperor and his support of the Luminous religion in China. So only a small part of it actually concerns theological concepts. And it is interesting for what makes it in there and what doesn't. So Adam makes it in there, but not Eve. And the Messiah, who isn't named, isn't called Jesus, makes it in there, but not Mary. And I know that the Ascension, I think, is in the Xi'an Stele inscription, but there isn't anything about a crucifixion. Rather, the word that's used to refer to the cross, which is in the inscription, is called shizi, which translates to the figure of 10, because in Chinese, 10 is written like a cross. So even if some like theological concepts that definitely are central to Christianity aren't making it in, others are. But as for the crucifixion specifically, I don't think that makes it in, but definitely the word for cross does. So it's alluded to.
Hmm, it's good to know. Oh, so here's a great question. So this is actually coming from someone studying at the Union Theological Seminary, and they're wondering what was the cross pollination between, or if there was cross pollination between Taoism and the Nestorians as far as their translation was concerned. So did they? How much did they draw from that tradition when they were trying to work out these concepts and translate them into the Chinese language?
Yeah, so I think definitely what I noticed most was Buddhism, actually, because what's important at this time is that Buddhism was still considered a Western religion in China at the time, as in it came westward from China, from northern India, like Christianity along the Silk Road into Chinese society. So Christianity and Buddhism, as well as like other Silk Road religions like Manichaeism or Zoroastrianism or Islam, were kind of still seen as foreign by some people in China at the time. So I definitely saw more of a relationship among those like five foreign religions coming from the Silk Road as opposed to Christianity and its relationship to the religions that actually came out of China, like Taoism, or you could argue Confucianism. But I know that other scholars have argued that there is a lot of Taoist influence on the Christians in China during this era. And I think a lot of that does come through in the translated terms and concepts. So it didn't show up in the Xi'an Stele as much for me, at least in the part that I read, but I know that other documents surviving from this time do make use of Taoist terminology, but so do the Buddhist texts.
Mhm.
So it's important to keep in mind that I think a lot of this was what religious terms and concepts already exist in Chinese that we can use to talk about our religion.
Mhm. And oh, so here's another great question. So, and I know you talked about this in one of your blog posts for us. Matteo Ricci, was he aware of what had happened in China in the 7th century?
Yeah, that's a good question. So interestingly, the stele, like I said, was rediscovered in the early 1600s, buried in the ground outside Xi'an's city. So this came at kind of like an apropos time for the second, or probably like more like third or fourth waves of Christians coming into China, which was Matteo Ricci and Italian Jesuits and Dominicans. So for them, this stele represented a very important find and an important motivation for their being in China, because during this time, the fall of the Ming Dynasty, there was a lot of, if not persecution, then at least instability occurring in China at the time. And some of that instability was definitely directed at foreigners. So a lot of them were confined to the coastal cities in case they needed to leave quickly. And they weren't really allowed to go try to proselytize or convert at this time. And Matteo Ricci had been dead for a while. So when they rediscovered this, they kind of saw it as a hope that because Christianity had existed in China since, the 7th century, that meant it could exist again here, even if like it seemed like kind of a hopeless era for them at the moment.
Mhm.
So yeah, definitely its rediscovery in the early 1600s was really significant for the Christian community once again existing in China at the time.
Oh, so the next question I think follows up the previous one pretty well. So when are there any, or were there any vestigial communities of this first Christian community in later years? So when Matteo Ricci and the Jesuit missionaries arrived, or Dominicans or other groups, did they find any living signs of this community, not just archaeological?
Yeah, so that's also a really good question. Apparently it's hard to prove a lot of that. So some scholars think that uh, the Uyghur community, when they converted to Islam, kind of absorbed a lot of the Christians who may have existed past the anti-foreign reaction that caused for the stele to be buried. So a lot of scholars thought that like the really strong and populous Islamic community in China were partially descended from any Christians who once existed there from the medieval era. There's also a lot of secret societies in China and Chinese society actually that some scholars thought might be vestigial, like you said, remnants of people who were once Christians in the medieval era. But again, it is hard to prove a lot of that stuff. But what we do know is definitely that the burial of the Xi'an stele wasn't the end of Christianity in China. So if you remember, I said the Church of the East did a lot of missionary efforts across Central Asia. So they actually converted a lot of Mongolian tribes. So later, when the Tang Dynasty fell, and like I think a few hundred years later, when Yuan or the Mongolian dynasty came to power, Christians once again were active in the court as advisors to Genghis Khan or Kublai Khan or the other Mongolian emperors. So yeah, the Xi'an stele was definitely not the end all. There were, but I think it more came in waves, Christianity, as opposed to a continuous like vestigial communities that keep getting built up again. But yeah, so I don't know, it's hard to prove a lot of that. Like Japan was a different situation where Japanese Christians who were converted were able to kind of keep their religion in secret and continue to have it. And then years later, when Japan opened up again, you were able to see these Japanese Christians still practicing. But I think with China, it was a little bit of a different situation.
Interesting. So we have another history question. And so you talked about this in your presentation, and this has come out in some of the questions, but it appears that there was distinct anti-foreign movement in China at different points in its history. And when did that happen? What was it? And why did it lead to the burying of the stele and ultimately the persecution of the Christian community in China, or maybe the dormancy of the Christian community in China?
Yeah, sure. I can say more about that. So basically, what seems to have happened is that as Confucianism rose in power within the court, within the Tang dynasty and empire, that resulted in kind of reactions against possible rivals to Confucianism as like the leading court ideology. So a lot of those rivals were perceived as foreign. So like I said, Buddhism, and wrapped up within Buddhism were these other Silk Road religions like Christianity. So there survives like an edict from that time where I forget who the emperor was at the time, but it was one of the Tangs. And he said that he was going to close all the Buddhist temples, defrock the clergy. And he said in this edict, I'm also going to do the same to the Christians existing in the empire. So we definitely know that they were defrocked, which meant that they weren't allowed to be clergy anymore. They had to return to lay society so they could pay taxes. And we definitely know that their churches were closed. So we think it was probably during, or a lot of scholars think it was probably during this era that the stele was buried to kind of protect it from this state-sponsored campaign against foreign religions. So I hope that gives a little more context about why it was buried.
I think so. I hope our audience agrees. So, I mean, another question coming in that I think follows the previous one. The idea that there was Silk Road religions, and we talked about Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, but Buddhism ultimately took root in China far more deeply and successfully than these other religions, or these imports, if you'd like to call them that. Why do you think that was? Was it court politics? Was it cultural? Was there something spiritual, theological going on in China?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I probably a little bit above my pay grade in terms of answering. But I think probably why Buddhism took such a strong hold was that it was an Asian religion already from India. So it was, I think, more of a adjacent move, literally and figuratively. And there were a lot of resonances in Buddhist philosophy with Chinese philosophy coming from Taoism and Confucianism. So it took to the culture already existing there at the time a little more deeply and significantly. Um, but as for why, Christianity and Zoroastrianism and any of these other Western religions didn't take on, part of the reason probably was translation. It was really hard to explain these concepts like the Trinity to Chinese people at the time. But another reason why scholars think maybe it didn't catch on as much as Buddhism is that they just might not have put enough efforts into their missionary activities. So these were Persians who may have mostly catered to other Persian merchants or other foreigners coming into China for trade. So it may have been kind of expatriate community that served other Persian Christians who came into China for those reasons and weren't ever going to be there fully. But I think what the reason why Christianity itself never really took a hold on in China is because Christianity always relied on political support to gain access to the people. And this is definitely encoded in the Xi'an Stele because it really is a memorial to the emperor and his efforts in promoting the religion. So if ever the political tide turned against the current emperor, it would turn against anything that he also supported, including Christianity or any of the other foreign religions that he may have built temples to. So because Christianity was almost always too closely tied to power, too
Mhm.
closely tied to the throne, whenever the political situation became unstable, definitely it was always going to be collateral damage in that.
Mhm. Interesting. Interesting. So I have a question about the original your translation work and your work into linguistics and maybe the history of that. Do we know how? I mean, do we have any historical knowledge of how these monks, what texts they worked with? How did they, how did they learn Chinese? Of course, I'm sure there were traders going back and forth. Um, then what they actually used to translate into Chinese? Did they create dictionaries per se? Did they create uh, copies of excuse me, copies of the Psalms, for instance? So text to distribute to the communities they were attempting to evangelize.
Yeah, so one of the most interesting things to me that I learned doing this research is that we definitely know that they worked with Buddhist clergy in translating Buddhist texts and concepts. So I think that they probably learned a lot from that working relationship. And sometimes it wasn't always necessarily like, oh, we're translating from Sanskrit into Chinese or we're translating from Syriac into Chinese. It was more like, they found a Uyghur text written in the Uyghur language, and they wanted to translate that particular Buddhist text written in Uyghur into Chinese. So it kind of went through geographically Central Asia in terms of going through the different countries and the different languages. So I think to me, it seems like that relationship was pretty influential because you can see in the research I did in the inscription itself, they're using words from Buddhist texts and scriptures that we know they would have been familiar with because they were working to help translate those Buddhist texts and scriptures. But as for other stuff they left behind, there is a lot of liturgical prayers and psalms that you can find in, like I said, the Dunhuang Silk Road caves, where a lot of those texts have been preserved. So in terms of what exactly they were translating, it wasn't necessarily like they weren't translating the Bible, but they were translating um, kind of actually in the form of sutras, like poetic descriptions of the religion. So I didn't look at those texts as much because those were kind of when the Persian Christians first arrived, and I more looked at what they were doing later by the time they had been in China for a while. But yeah, I think usually it was liturgy. So we know that they were definitely having masses and ceremonies and that they were using that in Chinese.
So another question about translation and linguistics. So we often talk about how translation into different language, different idioms, different dialects changes Christian concepts. But from your own personal experience studying Chinese, learning about the culture, did that give you a different understanding of Christianity? Did that make you think about it in a different way?
Hmm. That's a good
Yeah.
question.
So did the forces move in the both directions?
It definitely made me understand like how hard it is to translate and how difficult I think the translation, I guess, process or transformation is. And I think, kind of by examining this inscription, I was really able to get into the heads of the translators themselves and kind of examine like the problems or the difficulties they had to overcome and surmount to try to explain Christianity to an audience that really had no idea what it was and had no like foundational framework for understanding it. And I think that shows up a lot in the translation that I talk about for the Trinity. Because we know like missionaries have always had a lot of trouble translating the Trinity because it is a difficult concept of how can three people be in one single identity, and it's hard to explain even to people who grew up as Christians. So in terms of how this project made me think differently about Christianity, it definitely made me, I think, become more aware of how Christianity presents in different cultures and kind of how inscrutable it might be outside of the West, or like the Western conception of the religion. So it definitely got me thinking about that, I would say.
So same question, but pulling it away from the personal. Was there any evidence that the influence flowed back to the Middle East from China? Were there things that the monks took away from their experience with the Chinese and then incorporated or into their theology, their writings, their
Yeah.
practice in any way?
So one thing that I could think of that I read, but I don't really know for sure if it's true or just something that was kind of um, a theory, but apparently Christian clergy got the idea of celibacy from Buddhist clergy. So apparently in Persia at the time, it would have been like kind of a faux pas to be a celibate clergyman. Like the existing Zoroastrians were not celibate, and a lot of scholars were kind of confused about where did this idea of celibacy come from within the the Eastern Church and then eventually the Roman Church. And apparently a lot of people think it was from the Eastern sects like Buddhism, which are celibate. And another thing that I also learned, not specifically from China, but definitely from the East, is that apparently when monks sing at certain hours of the day, many scholars think that might be co-opted from Islamic people and Muslims praying at certain hours of the day. So I think those are just like two kind of surface level examples of maybe stuff from the East that flowed into the West, certain religious practices that may have come from Eastern and Middle Eastern cultures. But yeah, I definitely concentrated more on the other direction. But I would say those are two interesting examples to think about.
Okay. So we only have time for one or two more questions. So we have one here asking more about evidence that survived this time. Was there any sort of liturgical rubric that survived? And if so, what might it be?
Yeah, so a lot survives, interestingly, that scholars have definitely pored over. I know that there's a creed, and there are a lot of prayers. And what's interesting about these prayers is that they are called sutras.
Mhm.
So one definitely interesting sutra that you can check out is called the Sutra of Hearing the Messiah. And they think that this is one of the earliest translated texts. So what's important to keep in mind is that probably the imperial scribes working in the library to help translate these texts probably had a lot of control over what the final product was in terms of the translated terms and concepts from Christianity. So if you wanted to compare kind of the two translation moments during this period, I would look at the Sutra of Hearing the Messiah and then look at the Xi'an Stele, and then you can see kind of the differences and how those words changed over time.
So one last question. So for people that want to learn more, is there anything you would recommend us reading, or museums are opening up in New York? Is there anything in some of our favorite museums that we might want to check out?
Yeah, I've been trying to see if I can find a replica of the Xi'an Stele, and apparently the Met used to have one, but I don't think they have it anymore. So yeah, I'm not sure. I know a lot of that stuff actually stayed. You can see the Xi'an Stele at a famous museum in China called the Forest of Steles, which has the one that I talked about in this presentation and a lot of others from Chinese history. So, hopefully if we're able to go to China soon,
Mhm.
we can go see that. But I guess in terms of other reading, like definitely a book that I read for this research that I really enjoyed was P.Y. Seiki's The Nestorian Monument. So he was kind of a really prolific scholar in the field. And it's definitely a dated book from like the 1920s, but it was definitely pretty revealing to me in terms of looking at these translated terms and concepts. So I definitely recommend P.Y. Seiki's Nestorian Monument in China. That was definitely a big source that I looked at. And yeah, I'm not sure about museums in New York that carry Church of the East artifacts, but I do know that there are a lot in China that survive.
Okay, great. So we all have a little homework to do, a little research to do. One final question. So you are part of our first Duffy class. Would you mind sharing the experience with us, how it might have impacted your work, and what you might take from it going forward now that you've
Yeah,
graduated?
yeah, sure. So I love being a Duffy Fellow. It was definitely like one of the big pinnacles of my college career, especially during senior year. The program definitely gave me a lot of support to be able to do as in-depth a project as this, which I was really grateful for. I was also able to get a lot of editing and writing help that I was really grateful for, to be able to create interesting blog posts and kind of get my name out there a little bit more. And I was also able to make a video pitch to an academic YouTube channel called Religion for Breakfast. And I definitely know I wouldn't have been able to work on all those cool projects without help from David and David. So thanks so much to them and to the center. Yeah, I definitely, in terms of how I'm gonna take this forward, I definitely want to learn more about linguistics and learn more about Chinese, and I definitely want to use my time as a CRC Duffy Fellow to kind of leap more into the academic world and study linguistics more. And I know that all these projects that I worked on in this presentation have given me not only the foundational knowledge, but definitely also the practice in presenting that research. So yeah, I definitely really love my time
Oh,
with the
thank you for those warm words.
fellow.
Do you have any final thoughts for us today?
Yeah, I guess the final thought that I would like you all to take away is that this is some really interesting history that I think can really reorient our view of the world and I'm really fascinated by the Silk Road, not just in terms of the Christians who were using it, but in terms of all the other people across Asia and Europe and East Asia who were using it. So I guess the one takeaway I would say to everyone is definitely go research the Silk Road more. There's a lot of interesting history and religious studies opportunities there. I think you'll find that you learn a lot more about world history by starting with the Silk Road.
That's a great closing thought. So Anastasia, once again, thank you for this wonderful conversation you've treated us today. A big thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. As noted, the video will be posted on our YouTube channel in the coming days. Tomorrow night, Wednesday, June 9th, at 7 o'clock, we'll be hosting our next Duffy Fellows event, Fifth Cup, a reading of a play written by India Derewetsky. Take care, everyone, and we hope to see you tomorrow night for some live theater.